This is going to be the demonstration on anatomy and head anatomy, and I'm going to start out just reviewing a little bit about the head and skull for matters of the portrait. Define all the major shapes. For example, the muscles don't really change the shapes of the bone. So all these shapes are predefined, and they're going to be altered just slightly. And I'm going to start out with the top part of the head, and I think I'll start out over here with the temporalis. And the temporalis is a large muscle that attaches to the side of the skull, starting out around the parietal edge, which is right up here. And so what this muscle does is it lifts the jaw. So it's a very large, powerful muscle, and it goes right underneath this zygomatic bone and attaches itself to the jaw right about there. So from the side, it looks like this. And it attaches there. So this muscle doesn't really have much of doesn't create a profile or anything, but sometimes when people speak, you can see some movement in this area. It's probably one of the strongest muscles in the body. For example, think of a trapeze artist that has to hang by holding something in their mouth by this muscle that holds that piece in place. So the second muscle, large muscle on the top of the skull, is the frontalis, and it starts about here, right about where a normal hairline would start, and it comes down to the brow ridge. And this muscle is the muscle that makes it possible for us to lift our brow, which creates wrinkles across the front of the brow. And we are bilateral, so everything that happens on the one side also happens pretty much the same on the other. The next major muscle that we get to coming down is the Orbicularis Oris, and that's the muscle that makes it possible for us to wink, to squint, and that is an orbital muscle that wraps around the eye. And in fact, it covers the whole area, even the eyelid, because that muscle is the muscle that also controls the eyelid. Now there's another orbital muscle on the face and the head, and that's the muscle that wraps around the mouth. And this is the muscle that makes it possible for us to whistle, for example. And most of the muscles from here down are muscles that control the mouth, because most of the function that our head or our face does is the movement of the jaw. So everything from here down is going to be controlling the jaw. So the next group of muscles that I'm going to put down are going to be the zygomaticus, and that is the muscle that connects the top of the zygomatic to the Orbicularis Oris. And you can see right around the middle of that zygomatic, comes down, and a lot of these muscles are actually attaching to a node that is part of the Orbicularis Oris, and it happens right on the corners of the mouth, and that actually does create a shape on the mouth. And the fibers of this muscle sort of tie into that node. And these muscles, like the zygomaticus, major and minor, which is right beside it, attach, and that helps to pull this whole area back. So it helps to laugh, for example. And I forgot to do this to the side. So there is orbicularis around the eye, the oculi, and the one around the mouth. And coming right up underneath the lip. And the little node happens right on the corner. And that's apparent right on the corner of the mouth, and it helps form the little dimple right at the end of the mouth. So I'm going to come in with the zygomaticus, starting right about there on that bone, and down to the node on the Orbicularis Oris. Now the next, I'm going to switch over to my red crayon again, because this is another large muscle, and this is the masseter. And the masseter connects the zygomatic to the jaw. It comes right about to the end of the zygomatic bone and all the way to the corner. And this is another large, powerful muscle that works in concert with the temporalis to close the jaw, to chew, and move the mouth. So from the side, it comes about halfway down the jaw, like this. And many times on males, this is a more powerful muscle. It's a muscle that sometimes shows and sometimes doesn't. It has to do with how much body fat a person has, how muscular a person is. Some people, Mesodorfs, for example, are simply more muscular and have more mass in that muscle. So it's typically, you'll see this in a very powerful jaw. Sometimes it even creates a little bit of a change of plane from the jaw to the chin. And it typically, in a feminine head, that won't show so much. This is a lot quieter. There's one more little muscle that attaches from the jaw to this node, and that's called the rosoris. But you don't really have to think much about that, because it's a small muscle. You'll never see it. Some people don't even have a rosoris, and some people have it on one side only. Next muscle I think I'm going to put in is going to be a very important little muscle that is small, a small but powerful muscle, and that is the corrugator. And the corrugator is the muscle that, when we do this, for example, it pulls the forehead down in this direction, and sometimes you'll see a little dimple in that area when the corrugator concentrate that. If we're focusing, for example, or concentrating, sometimes that activates the corrugator. Another muscle that you don't see you really can't see at all, is the proceras, and that attaches right here in the middle, comes down to the nose, and it helps to lift the muscles of the nose ever so slightly. So again, it's not nearly so important as this. This really controls expression, and that's what really this is all about, is beginning to just understand what muscles create the action, for example, a smile or a frown or something like that. Or sometimes in the case of a masseter, an actual change of plane. The next muscle I think I'm going to do is the triangularis, and that is a muscle that comes from this node at the corner of the orbicularis down, and it's got sort of a triangular feel to it. Right on the tip of the chin, and that's the mentalis. And with President Obama, you'll note that his orbicularis, particularly right down here in the bottom, is very pronounced. It's something that is just unique to his physiognomy, to his anatomy. We all have the same equipment, but for some reason, certain things show more in some than others. And then there's a muscle called the platysma, which is actually a very thin, it's not so much a muscle as it is a fascia. And it connects underneath all the way through here, and eventually will come down into the neck. If you do this with yourself, you'll feel those that fascia sort of coming out and projecting. And it starts here in the mouth and continues down into the neck. Now that I've got the levator inferior placed from the lower lip down to the bottom of the jaw, there's a second levator muscle, and that's one that starts at the zygomaticus and comes down in the same direction of the nose. And that is also a levator that helps lift and adjust this Orbicularis Oris and the whole upper jaw. And so from the side, that takes this position right into that orbicular muscle. Now I'm going to just come back up and add this frontalis from the side. And I'll add the proceras. And lastly, the corrugator that matches that. And that's just about it for the superficial anatomy of the face. There are many more muscles, but they're deep muscles, and they're not things that we really need to talk about for portrait anatomy. For example, there's a large buccinator underneath that really controls the mouth, but that's really underneath the masseter and covered by the platysma. And so I think that's where I'm going to stop right now. Now we have the head and facial muscles, so the next is going to be the superficial muscles of the neck, and these are really the muscles that control all the movement of our head. So starting out with the platysma, which really is a very flat muscle and covers this whole area, but it linked to the lower area of the jaw. And it really covers most of this, and it's a very thin, striated group of muscle. It doesn't really show much, so I'm going to basically leave it underneath. The major muscles are the sternocleidomastoid, and these muscles are named basically for their origin insertions, and they start, for example, with the sternocleidomastoid. Means that the origin is at the sternum area here. So it goes from the sternum up to the mastoid, and the mastoid is back here. So that comes this way, and it's kind of a tubular shaped muscle, and it connects at the base of the skull, and it comes down. It's broad in the middle and then narrows toward a tendon that connects to this sternum, or manubrium, which is this bone. And it's broad and then gets thin at the bottom. And this muscle is what gives the neck its width from the front. Now, remember it's sternocleido, so cleido refers to the clavicle. So the second head of that sternocleido muscle spins off and attaches to the clavicle. And from the front comes straight down like that and makes that connection. Okay, so the second, that's the first large muscle group. The second, basically there's only two, the sternocleidomastoid and the trapezius. The trapezius starts also in the back of the head, and it comes down and it spins out, and it goes out toward the end of the clavicle and the scapula, which is in the back here. So it really comes down about halfway into the clavicle. That's where it begins. And then it spins out. It connects along the whole top of the clavicle. And then it actually continues to go down and fan out, and it comes down to the top and the bony ridge of the scapula. So what happens is from the front, the top of the neck achieves its width from the sternocleido, but as you come down, the trapezius comes out and creates the width of the neck toward the bottom. I think one more thing I'd like to point out is the hyoid, which is the Adam's apple. And from the front, it kind of looks like this. And it's more apparent in a male than it is a female. On a female, it's also a little bit lower. On a male, a little bit higher, and a little more prominent on a male. So the only reason I mention that is that it really does affect the profile. You can't see it so much from here. Sometimes you might see a little shadow, but from the side it really does create a very special profile. Okay, I'd like to give you some details now, some close-ups of the eye and its setting. And I'll just start out with an eyeball. And in the middle of the eyeball is the iris. In the middle of the iris is the pupil. And so this is, sort of a gray color in sculpture. This would be what's either blue or brown, and the pupil. So now, always a third of the eye is covered by either the eyelid or sometimes the eye fold, which is a fleshy area that comes down in age, sometimes even over the eyelid. And then I'm going to do the window of the eye, which is the opening. And notice that it's not just a football, but that it has an axis, not that straight up, an axis like this. That means it's a little higher here. The center is a little lower, and then the lower spot is on that side. So it creates an axis that goes like that. And so it always goes into a tear duct, which leads toward the nose. And then the bottom of the eye just about touches the iris. And so now I get to explain where the root of the nose is. And maybe I'll do this from the side also, just to make this more clear. There's the eyeball, there's the iris, pupil, and the lid comes down over. Actually, I think it's going to come out a little bit farther. lower lid, and this is the white area, and that's referred to as the sclera. And this would be the brow area. And now between the root of the nose, which is right about here, and the orbital shape of the skeleton, it drops down like this, and there is the infraorbital, so this is supraorbital part of the bone, the infraorbital, which is the bottom part. And now down into the nose. And I want to keep going back and forth because I want to show you, I make this a little darker along the edge because that's where the lash is, and also the lid itself creates a little bit of a shadow because it hovers out just slightly over the ball. And so painters usually paint something, put a little gray there so that it looks like that shadow. And now I'm going to come back to this bone again, and I want to show you that this space between that is where I call this a U-turn. And it just is a way to account for the space, because some people take this corner of the eye too far toward the nose, and that creates kind of an odd look. So always remember that there's room for a little U-turn in between the root of the nose and the corner of the eye. And then here's the tear duct, and there's a minor U-turn right here, and that leg of that goes out to follow the eye sac, and the bottom leg of that follows the infraorbital shape of the bone. Now the eye bone comes down around here to protect that. Lower lid comes out, and then we're out into the cheek area. And you might see at this point the nose coming out that way. So I think next I'm going to show you some of the close-ups of the nose. I'm about to start on a close-up of the nose, and noses are always a lot of fun because they're all so very different. And so I'm just going to start out with the profiles, which are probably the most dramatic aspect of a nose, because when we look at a nose from the front, this is the root of the nose, infraorbital, eyebrow. But I just want to get down into the body of the nose from the front, and there's the opening in the skull, but the nose comes down this far, and then that infraorbital bone comes out, and so from the side here, this creates a pyramidal shape that is what I call the base of the nose. And then there's a cartilage that comes down from the bone, and then there is cartilage for the alar. And the reason it's important to know this stuff for sculpture is because these are the things that create the shapes. They create, we never get to see this, and so it's the underlying forms that create the little reflections and facets and things. For instance, typically on a nose, you'll see a facet that happens right about here. And I'm going to do this from the side. Maybe I'll do it from here and keep it. Okay, so that's the end of the bone, but the cartilage continues down, and then there's the alar. And so the variation from here to here, this could come out, that bone could come out that far, and then the cartilage could drop, and then the alar could project out beyond that. And so those planes, that one and that one, create that shape. And so now if we begin to add the nostril, go up for the nostril, there's the opening, bottom of the nostril, bottom of the alar, and create a little shadow there. And this is the opening of the nostril. And so this many times gets a highlight because it protrudes. And now I'm going to just do the nostril. And then it drops down from here back in to the philtrum and eventually into the lip. And so we can't see from the front when we're modeling. We can see the peripheral borders or the inner profiles of the nostril and of the alar, but we can't make out the projections. And so typically right about there, this part goes into shadow. And so we can't tell that from the front until we're drawing, and then we could say, okay, there's a shadow, so now I can see that that's turning. But to really understand it, you really have to see it from the side. So this is just one more reason why you need to really examine these shapes. You can't work from one position too long. You really need to move around from front to side to three-quarter, and to really, once you're aware of these shapes underneath, then you'll begin to look for them. You'll be able to read between the lines and know what to expect, why you're seeing a highlight on the top of the alar, or why you're seeing a shadow. Why does that shadow start here? Well, it's because it changes planes at that point, and this goes into shadow. Okay, so the mouth is going to be the next one of my favorite things, and I think because it's there's just, again, so many variations on this theme, and if you're anything like me, I become obsessed with shapes and variations on a theme, and I love to just study the differences between mouths. But I'm going to just start off with just sort of a generic mouth, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the three parts. And the first part is the milk tooth, and also I'm going to talk about the Cupid's bow, because that's kind of a memorable thing. And if you can imagine a bow shaped like that, and the center node of the upper lip is the milk tooth, and I can put a little shadow on it from the side. Now the two sides are more oblong, and again we're bilateral, so always remembering that center line. Now what's so wonderful about this is the way that the two bottom lobes nestle between that shape. Just a perfect fit. And then there's the bottom. And now we just have to connect. And we've got the lip, and then typically on the corners there's a little node that wraps around, and sometimes again you'll see that little division between the first. Now oddly enough, on some people this is very subtle, and in fact instead of coming down like that, some lips just kind of go almost across like that. And again, typically this is going to go into shadow a little bit because it's coming in. So if we looked at this lip from the side, That's going to be the top. And again, with most models, we're going to be thinking about what these projections are. And a lot of times what happens, students will come in too quickly, too fast on that lip and forget that really the lip has a front to it. And so after we get this little lift, which creates a term, a linea alba, which just means white line. And why it's white is because the light is coming from above and it bounces off of this little lift and creates a white effect. And again, that is very typical in African American and Hispanic lips that are very beautifully defined. And sometimes there'll even be a little bit of an indentation right there that creates a bit of a shadow that also helps to create the lip line. And as I said, in ideal proportion, which maybe we're referring to classical times. In classical times, and the Greeks would typically always make the lower lip step in a little bit farther from the upper lip. However, in real life, many times it's the reverse of that. Again, it's just variations on a theme. But there is the lip line, and again, sometimes a little nodule. What I'm doing here is doing that, and that creates a bit of a shadow along the edge here, particularly right in through here. There's a little pad, and then this is the Orbicularis Oris that wraps around. That's the muscle, and it comes up and tucks in underneath the lip. There's the chin. And there's the corner of the mouth. And that usually gets a little darker in that area. And I could throw this into shadow a little bit because, again, the light is coming down, the shadow is on this side, and the highlight is on the bottom. And when we come this from the side, you have no way of knowing this projection. So if we were doing a painting, what we would do is we would throw this into shadow, and then this would be the highlight, and then halfway down again, we'd be in the shadow, and the reason being is because that is shadow. And what happens is the light is coming down, and there's shadow in this area. The minute the sculpture begins to step out, the light reflects off of the change of plane and creates a highlight. So, okay, so this is the anatomy. These are the parts to the lip. Every lip have this anatomy. We all have 5 nodes or 5 basic shapes, but they're different in each and every one of us. And so what you have to be aware of, or what I would suggest you begin to look for, is how those variations of that same formula play out through every one that you look at in different races and young and old alike. So let's have a look at the ear. I'm going to draw the ear, and I'm going to tell you what the parts are, and it sounds kind of technical and anatomical, but I find that it's a lot easier to give the parts names. It's a little easier to remember them rather than just describe it as a hollow or a valley or a mound. So with the ear, I'm going to start with just sort of a profile, or rather a side view. And you remember I said on my model about a 70-degree angle, and the first part is going to be the helix. And many times on ears, they're not just round, there's facets to them, and they're all very different, but they have the same parts. And so I'm going to start out with the helix, which is this part, the upper part, and the helix comes into the center. The next big shape is the conch, and the conch is like a shell. It's a cup shape that catches the sound, and so that happens right about in the middle. And just to show you what this looks like from the front, it's going to be something like this. Helix comes out, and then in, and then there's the lobe right here, and there's the helix, and this of course is the skull, and maybe show a little bit of a sideburn that happens in there, and there's the conch, and then the back of the helix coming down, and the conch, since it's deeper, will give it a little shadow because it always is a little darker because it's deep. And the helix goes right into the middle of that. Now, there's a little shape here that's really part of the face, and that's this part right here. That's the tragus. It's a little bump, and it comes down and stops, and it has not a twin, but it has something that has a little bit of the same name. It's the antitragus, and that antitragus is this little bump that happens right before the groove or the notch, and the notch comes down this way, and from the front you don't really see too much of it, but the tragus comes in from the front, and all this is going in into shadow because that's a little deeper. And now we've got the helix, and then the next big shape coming down is the antihelix, and it forms sort of a Y shape. And the Y comes up this way, and one leg of the Y goes up underneath the helix, the front part, and the second Y goes up in this direction behind the helix. And so this is a little bit of a fossa, and what that means is just a low spot that collects a little shadow. And so there's some pretty deep shadows in the ear because of the depth of it. So we have helix, antihelix, the conch, the tragus, the antitragus, and the tragal notch. And from the front, helix, and then antihelix, there's the Y shape, the conch, which goes in pretty deeply, the tragus, the antitragus, the tragal notch, and the last part that I haven't talked about is simply the lobe. And so, of course, these variations on this are tremendous from person to person. So I encourage you again to begin to do this comparative anatomy study where you really start looking at people's ears, and if you feel a little too obvious, start wearing dark glasses. It's a trick I use a lot in airports because that way I can really stare at people and avoid being slapped. I'd like to talk a little bit about accentuating the features. Another term I use for that is turning up the volume on features. And what I mean by that is that if we take a nose, for example, what we're looking for in a portrait is to find out what it is about one person's nose that's very unique. What makes their nose very different, because every feature we have are variations on a theme, so we want to find out, to get a likeness, what it is that is so unique. So I'm just going to draw a couple here. That's a pretty, I'd say, ordinary nose. You know, our bone stops about there and then the cartilage comes down, but the way this happens changes so much on every one of us. For example, if I come over here to the middle, some noses come out and then along descent, and then when we get to the alar, it could continue down like this, or it could, at the beginning of the alar, it could change, and it could step out like that. So it's very important that we see the change of plane between there, here, and here. When we get down to the end of the alar, it turns. Now I'll just do another one right next to that one just to show you a very different nose. It could come down, and then when we get to the alar, that could turn out and do that sort of thing. So this part, the alar, comes like that. So in some noses, you'll see a highlight right in through here. And in some noses, there might not be anything at all. It could be just sort of a round shape like that. So when you're doing the portrait, you have to make a distinction here. You have to make sure that that little change of plane, however it changes, and I'll just do one more just for good measure. So these little details are very important. So now the next thing on a nose is some noses, after we clear the alar and we come back to the septum, at this point it could change and it come down that way. In some cases, the nose will come out and the mouth barrel will come that way. That's a very big change in profile, so you really have to be on the lookout for how that works. Also, the way some nostrils, typically the nostril will go up and then drop down, but not always. Sometimes you might not see that at all. It might come straight across like that. So I'll just demonstrate that a little bit on the front. Down to the septum, and this alar is going to come out like that. And now you might want to pay attention to whether the nostrils go up from the center or does the nostril come all the way down. That's enough to make a difference in a likeness. So accentuating the features could be a little thing like, does the ear come out there like that, or does it come out and down like that? That actually can happen. So I think I'll go over and demonstrate on the clay what I just talked about. Sometimes it's good to see a linear version of it. So I'm going to now work a little bit on this, and I always like to come back to that center line. Add a little bit for the alar, and you want to look for a plane on the bottom of the alar. That's pretty typical. And again, if someone has that plane, I would make it crisp and sharp so that it really shows up. Jump over here to the nostril, which really lays right on the front of the maxilla. And I'm going to pull that nostril down into the mouth barrel. And I'm going to turn this to the side a little bit so you can see the profile. So looking for those planes between where the bridge of the nose ends and the septum begins many times, creates a change of plane. So that's one place to look for the first change of plane. Right in through here, if this nose is more bulbous, that is where I'm going to play that up and pay a lot of attention to that shape. So I could count 1, 2, 3 planes. Sometimes if you enumerate them, it helps you to remember that they are separate planes. Now from the front, you want to pay attention to the width of the alar. I think I'll just exaggerate this a lot just to make a point. Go very wide on this alar. So these are things that immediately make that likeness. Some people have very finely chiseled looking noses, where others have very bulbous and soft, and the planes are much more nondescript. That would be a much fuller nose. And always bring that back into the nostril. There's usually a little plane that happens underneath. Even the width of the nose, up here at the bridge of the nose, some people have a very pinched, tight, narrow area, and then it widens out. Some people actually have a little bit of a cleft in the middle of their nose, and if that were the case, then I would actually turn up the volume on that cleft a little bit so that it's more like them. If I was doing Richard Nixon, I would accentuate that little bit of a ski jump of a nose, or if I was doing Bob Hope, I would do the same thing. I would look for these little curves that go around the alar. These are all distinctive little things that some of us have that are very subtle, but every sitter is going to have features that are unique to them. I'm looking for that one or those unique features, and then I'm going to highlight them and accentuate them. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about expression, and we're not going for extreme expression like rage or horror, surprise. With portrait, we're more concerned with more introspective, more psychologically complex expressions that reflect bemusement or melancholy or curiosity or vision, so many things. But at this point, I just want to talk about some of the muscles in the face that create those expressions, and typically it's in the eyes and in the mouth. So, for example, if one was to smile or laugh, when the mouth gets pulled back, it draws up this Orbicularis Oris in this direction, which closes the eye a little bit. So that would make the eye a little smaller, and it would begin to cause a little bit of a wrinkle here as this nasolabial fold gets pulled back and down. So you can see that creates, just even without changing the mouth, that gives a little bit of sort of, not exactly a smile, but a pleasant expression. It's still very passive in the eye area. What could change the eye area would be, for example, the corrugator, by contracting a little bit along with the orbicularis oculi muscle that runs around the eye and the frontalis that comes in concert. These muscles can create, they can lift the eye like this, or the eyebrow, and create a more open passive look. Or they could pull in and lower the brow this way, and they could lift the arch, which would create a whole different kind of expression. So mainly, this group of muscles around the eye have a huge amount of control with the expressions. And of course, as they do that, they push little skin folds closer together, for instance, right in through there. And you can see whenever that gets crunched a little bit, that creates sort of a concerned kind of look. So depending on the look that you're after, that's typically where you're going to be able to work these areas to create an expression. I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about modeling in surface and the tools that I use to make the transitions, pull surfaces together, pull forms together, and that's best accomplished by a transitional tool that I would call a raking tool. And these are some of the tools that I use. This is a wire loop with notches in it. This is simply a wooden tool with a few subtle marks in it. This is a rubber tool with some rather large notches in it. And this is a steel rib with some rather large notches in it as well. And these are just some of my regular all-around tools for blocking and detailing. Okay, let's get started. So this head has been just roughly blocked in, and you see a lot of unfinished areas that now need to be tightened up. So this is where I'm going to begin now to make some transitions. This is a wooden tool that's got some very subtle notches in it here, and you can see that it's a broad tool. I can move a lot of clay at once. If I used my little notch tool, you can see it's a little more dramatic. It cuts very sharply, so if there's a lot of things standing up, this will pull that together. And when I'm modeling, I always model on a curve around the form. So it can be this way, this way, this way, but I'm going around the form. If you think of engraving, like a Dürer engraving, that's pretty much what they do. And what it does is it enhances the form. This is a tool I use usually with a little bit larger work, but you can see it too will produce a nice deep rake, and it will pull a shape together. It drags clay from one area and brings it into another. It's a little too large for this scale, but it's a good tool to know about. And sometimes you can make these notches smaller. They actually don't come like this. I carved these notches in myself. This is a tool I found a few years ago, and I just love it. It's got large notches in it, but the beauty of this tool is that I can use the side of it, and so I can control how much texture I'm getting. So if I want to play down the texture, but yet it sort of lovingly caresses and around the forms. And again, it's transitions that I'm looking for. I don't want to really erase some of these forms. In fact, some of the notches I'll leave because they reveal my labor, what I've done to achieve a particular form. And as long as it looks fresh and unlabored, that's a good thing. Sometimes we work very hard to cover up our labor. Right in through here, I'd like to make that. I don't want to overwork it, but it needs to be pulled together. And you know, every artist is going to determine how much texture they like. Some people like to work very smooth, and others like to work very rough. I'm somewhere in the middle, I guess. I like to see the hand in it. I like to see a little bit of surface energy. I like to see a little bit of the hand that went into it rather than erasing it all and making it all smooth. So I would just continue just to go over the whole surface, pull it together, make my transitions, and then there's nothing wrong with coming back and using the thumb to play down if something is a little too dramatic. Then I use my thumb to correct it. Again, always coming around shapes. And as I work and add things and take things away, I'll continue to use this tool. And I'll just, again, like you can see the marks very prominently there. If I just come back in and just back up a little bit, and so I can subdue them to where they're just a trace, and yet they show a little bit about the form. Okay, so what I'm doing really is I'm pulling together the surface, and I'm using these tools to create the form. It's not about just putting marks on it or smoothing it. It's about using the tool to follow the form to make the transitions, and in that process revealing some of the handwork that eventually we like to look at when we see sculpture. We like to see that surface energy.